On June the 8th, 1990, a young wrestler entered the main arena of the Nippon Budokan with an entire crowd roaring him on. Something that's not necessarily out of the ordinary perhaps. In the world of pro wrestling you should kind of expect that. But something was a little different on this night. The crowd had that much more energy when cheering on this man. There was the undefinable spark, the plainer measurement coming in the money that had been taken on that night for this particular wrestler's merch. Only a couple of weeks previously, the man had essentially declared himself reborn. He threw off the trappings of another identity into that crowd and immediately challenged the very biggest ace the company had to offer to a match. And that match is happening right now. It's not a match anyone would necessarily expect him to win, but everyone in the crowd has a little bit of hope that he will. And other people have taken notice of that. The man in question is, of course, Mitsuharu Misawa. And this is his match against the man who has been the ace of All Japan for well over a decade, Jumbo Tsuruta. It's not the first time they've met as such. They faced and teamed with each other several times when Misawa was wrestling as Tiger Mask, but everything about this time feels so different. Jumbo, already regarded by this point as one of the greatest to ever lace up a pair of boots, feels that whole new edge, something far removed from the rookie who first appeared in 1982, who then went to Mexico and returned under that famous mask. And as the match goes on, it all builds and builds. The crowd only get further and further behind the younger star, believing more and more that perhaps he could pull this off, even if they're also waiting for inevitability, for Jumbo to roar back, hit that high knee, pump that fist, deliver a final, fatal backdrop. Before that point though, Misawa has been delivering a fight for the ages, taking everything in the kitchen sink to Jumbo Tsuruta. It's a phenomenal match, and the atmosphere in the arena is one that the TV perhaps struggles to catch. Even if Misawa loses, it's a star-making performance. There is one particular moment, however, right near the end, which truly makes the fans embrace the unbelievable. When Jumbo seemingly readies for that comeback, runs at Misawa to crush him as he's done so many others, only to be reversed, to be sent flying, and to absolutely be mangled on the ropes, to be thoroughly discombobulated and wrecked. The screams and roars of Misawa get that much louder. Seconds later, Misawa reverses a suplex and goes for a backdrop. Jumbo desperately twists over for a pin, but then Misawa reverses the position, and the referee counts. 1, 2, 3. It's happened. Mitsuharu Misawa has pinned Jumbo Tsuruta, and the crowd becomes absolutely unglued, one of the biggest reactions the Nippon Budokan has ever seen. This is no longer just the making of a star, this is the making of an ace, a man who is going to define the promotion for the next decade. In many ways, this is the night where our story begins. And yet, not in every way. This is the story of Misawa, of course, but it is also the story of Toshiaki Kawada. In many ways, it's the story of this company as a whole in the 1990s. By general consensus, the top two stars in All Japan Pro Wrestling, Misawa and Kawada would not just define the company and the quality of their product in the ring, they would define each other's lives. They'd known each other since they were teenagers, had gone to the same high school, had both achieved success in amateur wrestling, and had both made the decision to go to All Japan. With Misawa being the year ahead of Kawada, Kawada had gone to the All Japan dojo after taking Misawa's own advice. Over the years they would team together, they'd win trophies together, belts together. They'd fight to establish the new generation against the establishment who didn't want to leave. But when they reached the top, the friendship didn't hold. They became bitter rivals, not just inside the ring, but outside of it too. Heated arguments and even occasional fisticuffs in the back would see that heat taken over to the ring and bring their work up to even greater stratospheres. In the end, even when they were apart, they were also together. You simply can't think of one without the other, and their legacy, in the end, is the greatest feud pro wrestling has ever seen. This is the story of Mitsuharu Misawa and Toshiaki Kawada. It's naturally going to take more than one video to get through it, so this video starts with their background, and largely with the years when they were coming of age and breaking into the main event. Let us begin. Misawa and Kawada both attended Ashikaga Kodai High School in the late 70s, and even though Misawa was a year ahead of Kawada, both would find themselves bonding. They had a fair amount in common, particularly as both became members of the school's amateur wrestling club. As it happened, the pair were pretty good at it, both winning the Shiga National Athletic Meet for high school wrestlers 1 year after the other. Misawa in particular was considered good enough to potentially become an Olympian if he'd stuck with amateur wrestling, while Kawada defeated one Keiichi Yamada in his final, who would also go on to become a wrestler. He's better known as Yushin Thunder Liger. Outside of an early love of pro-res and a general interest in sports, Kawada in Misawa is in many ways a good example of the high school senpai system, with Misawa very much being Kawada's senpai due to being a year ahead, and some would argue that this served as an overarching theme for their entire careers to come. Another thing the pair had in common was wanting to get out of the educational system as soon as possible in order to become pro wrestlers, although both in the end were convinced to finish their studies. Mitsuharu Misawa had precious little in the way of a home life and came from a broken family with an abusive father, with pro-res, specifically All Japan, as one of his few comforts. He wanted to enter the All Japan dojo as soon as possible and reached out personally to Jumbo Tsuruta himself in order to become accepted into the dojo, but Tsuruta said that he had finished his studies before entering All Japan and convinced Misawa to do the same. For Kawada, the decision to finish his studies proved pivotal. He did go to a dojo and he was actually accepted, but it was the New Japan dojo. Kawada had his own troubles in childhood, having lost his father at a very young age. As with Misawa, he would find a great deal of comfort in being a fan of pro wrestling. Kawada was more of a fan of New Japan growing up and wanted to train there, but his mother convinced him to finish his studies first and New Japan agreed to defer his entry for a year. In the year that followed, Misawa, then a part of All Japan's dojo, convinced Toshiaki Kawada that All Japan had a more familiar atmosphere and would be a better place for him to train. And so Kawada eventually joined Misawa in the All Japan dojo. So, yeah, if Kawada's mother doesn't convince him of the benefits of actually finishing his education, there's a big chance that nothing of what we're going to talk about ever happens. Both men would have varying experiences in the All Japan dojo. Misawa was certainly considered a pretty hot prospect from the beginning, having only been in the dojo a few months before making his in-ring debut. Misawa was primarily trained by Kazuharu Sonoda and Akihisa Miura, the Magic Dragon and Great Kabuki respectively, with other contributions coming from legends. Giant Baba himself, Dick Bayer, the original Destroyer, and even Lou Fez contributed to Misawa's training. The main thing Misawa did have to overcome, at first, was a rather visceral reaction to being involved in the fighting. He did at times get quite emotional in the dojo, reminded of his childhood. Kawada, meanwhile, primarily trained by Genichiro Tenryu, wasn't considered as much of a prospect at first, having to really struggle initially to get noticed compared to Misawa, although it certainly helped that Misawa had a full year on him. Both wrestlers soon made their full debuts for the promotion, Misawa in 1981, Kawada in 1982. There is record of them wrestling each other back in these rookie days, although sadly nothing that exists on video. It's said that Bubba saw the heavy potential in both very early on, and the crowds did take a little bit of interest, particularly in Misawa, in the sense that they were waiting to see what was to come. Eventually, Misawa had his first televised match in the Lou Fez Cup for All Japan's Young Rookies in 1983, losing in the final against another hot prospect trainee, Shiro Koshinaka. However, the match itself was so impressive that Baba gave both Misawa and Koshinaka the tournament's prize, that being a foreign excursion to EMLL in Mexico. Kawada would also, again around about a year later, go on his own foreign excursion. His would be to North America. The foreign excursion is very often something that a young puro wrestler, especially if they're a hot prospect, will have to do. The wrestler must go and hone their craft, become familiar with other styles, become well-rounded, and perhaps also experience some bullshit. Just because a wrestler is an incredibly hot prospect doesn't necessarily mean they're going to get top treatment abroad. Misawa and Koshinaka certainly had a tough time in EMLL, wrestling as Kamikaze Misawa and Samurai Shiro respectively, Although Misawa was definitely grateful for further tutelage from one of the company's most talented luchadors, La Fiera, which would certainly put him in very good stead for what was to come. As for Kawada, well, his foreign excursion was a bloody misery. He first went over to Texas All-Star Wrestling, and from there over the northern border to Stu Hart's Stampede Wrestling, and finally Brian Valos's International Wrestling in Montreal. The Stampede work is perhaps most famous, although when he was there he either wrestled as the masked heel Black Mephisto or as Koi Kawada, billed from South Korea despite having no Korean heritage. One historical curio from this time is a match from Stampede as Mephisto, wrestling against a young guy by the name of Chris Benoit, with the commentators basically taking the piss throughout. But yeah. By all accounts, Toshiaki Kawada utterly hated his time in North America, and he's not spoken about it all that much. His excursion lasted way longer than Misawa's, ultimately adding up to nearly 2 years, and during that time he only really made a couple of friends, most notably Rick Martel in Montreal. Some even say that his time in North America may have contributed to a reluctance to ever wrestle outside of Japan again, and possibly even to a distrust and resentment of foreign wrestlers in general. Eventually, both would be back in Japan. Indeed, Misawa would be back a great deal sooner than he expected. All Japan bought the likeness rights for the Tiger Mask manga character, originally and most famously played previously by Satoru Sayama in New Japan, from the character's creator Ikki Kajiwara, and Bubba decided to bring Misawa back to become Tiger Mask, even though he was only a few months into his year-long excursion. Kawada, who was a much more high-flying style of wrestler at the time, was also briefly considered for the role. One outcome of this was that Shiro Koshinaka, the winner of the Lufez tournament and traditionally the only one who would have received the prized excursion, ended up becoming an afterthought and was left in EMLL for too long. Pissed off by this, Koshinaka jumped to New Japan in 1985 and he would be pretty successful there. Anyway, Misawa made his All Japan debut as Tiger Mask, usually known as Tiger Mask 2 to differentiate him from the others who've played the character, on July 31st, 1984, wrestling against the man who'd mentored him in Mexico, La Fiera. This excellent match is many people's first encounter with Misawa. Indeed, after he died, the packages of matches that were shown in tribute started with this match, as opposed to the earlier televised debut against Koshinaka. It is indeed a very good match, one of the best Misawa had under the mask, with a lot of the high-flying moves he'd been taught taking a well-deserved spotlight, although the highlight of the match really is watching La Fiera, a truly magnificent luchador, at work. Definitely worth checking out this match if you've not seen it. However, for the most part, Misawa hated his time as Tiger Mask. As good as he was, being Tiger Mask wasn't really what he wanted, and he never felt as though he was able to embody the character quite like Satoru Sayama had done, that it wasn't quite fully his style. That and he just hated wrestling in a mask. Considering how varied Misawa was in his skills as a wrestler, it's perhaps understandable that he felt as though the character and style that was expected of Tiger Mask was a restriction on his in-ring expression, and he wasn't the only one to have the same issues. The next man to play Tiger Mask after him, Koji Kanemoto in New Japan, had similar troubles connecting with the character. It would take until 1995 and the arrival of Yoshihiro Yamazaki, a trainee of Sayama's, to the character for someone to really fully solidify themselves as Tiger Mask again. So much so that Yamazaki is still Tiger Mask to this very day. Still, for all of Misawa's discomforts with the character, he still played the role of Tiger Mask for 6 years, way longer than the 2 years Sayama originally played him for, and he did a lot of very good work in that time, which we will be getting to shortly. After Kawada returned from his awful time abroad in 1986, he soon found himself paired up with his mentor Genichiro Tenryu. He'd be part of the Revolution stable and, most famously early on, he teamed with Samson Fuyuki, later Hiromichi or Kodo Fuyuki in FMW, in the quite popular sprightly young team of Footloose. I guess you could call Footloose, being that it's a duo of sprightly young, high-flying and attractive-looking men, this was before Kawada lost his front teeth, a Japanese version of the Rock and Roll Express or the Midnight Rockers. And it's kind of apt that Kawada and Fuyuki actually started teaming in America when the pair were on foreign excursion. Footloose got their start in Texas, were originally managed by Gary Hart, called the Japanese Force, and wrestled against other young similar teams, including one consisting of Paul Diamond and a certain Shawn Michaels. But it was back in Japan where they would really shine, capturing the All-Asia Tag Team Championship 3 times over the rest of the 1980s. The Footloose years certainly show a very different side to Kawada, and I'd highly recommend checking out the matches that they had with the Can-Am Express of Doug Furness and Dan Crawford, because they're pretty bloody good. Just what you would expect from 2 high-quality teams, really. Not too sure about those zebra pants, though. Tiger Mask 2 had a bit of success of his own, winning the junior title in 1985. However, being a junior in All Japan was always going to have a bit of a ceiling, seeing as the company has always been centred a great deal more around heavyweights, far more so than New Japan. He held on to the junior title until 1986, when he vacated it after moving up to the heavyweights, where he would definitely have a great deal more exposure. A lot of that exposure would come both teaming with and indeed facing against Jumbo Tsuruta. The initial steps in a rivalry between the young Misawa and the elite Tsuruta came when Misawa formed a stable of younger wrestlers called Kekigun, something of a prototype for what was to come. However, the Kekigun stable was never quite able to establish itself, partly due to being booked rather weakly, and also due to Misawa suffering heavy injuries at the time, most seriously a torn ACL, that kept him out for lengthy periods and ultimately pushed him away from the high-flying work expected of Tiger Mask. There was a lot of effective work during this time, as well as some quite curious matches. Misawa as Tiger Mask did end up having matches against the original Tiger's 2 most legendary opponents, Dynamite Kid and Kuniaki Kobayashi. One of his matches against Kobayashi in particular was an absolute barn burner, and the first of many Misawa matches to be voted Match of the Year in the Wrestling Observer. Right near the end of his time as Tiger Mask, he also had a match that, certainly later on, would have been thought of as a dream match to end all dream matches. Misawa vs Bret Hart in April 1990 at the WWF AJPW Super Show. And the weird thing was, well, it wasn't all that good. There's always been a bit of a mystery surrounding this one. These two just did not click, and some say that there was a misunderstanding as to how much time they actually had, meaning the end result was an unexpected draw. Bret Hart, unlike most anyone else, was not particularly enthusiastic about Misawa in his biography, saying he wasn't worth shit compared to the original Tiger Mask. Some others may also point to Bret being considerably jet-lagged, and Misawa just coming off a knee injury, along with the clash of styles and communication issues, but yeah, it just didn't really work. There were also intriguing matches against Kurt Hennig, Ricky Steamboat, and Ric Flair during the Tiger Mask years. Much like Bret, this was the only time Misawa ended up facing these opponents. Generally speaking, these matches work out a great deal better than the one against Bret Hart. And in something of a parallel between these two legends who didn't work out together, much like Bret Hart in WWF, a match against Ted DiBiase would be important. In 1987, Tiger Mask faced DiBiase, then an All Japan regular, and picked up his first significant singles victory against a big heavyweight. Much like Bret's later matches with the $1 Million Man that were one of the first showings of just how good a singles wrestler he was going to be, Misawa's win against the established DiBiase was a signifier of how much All Japan were behind Misawa. Or, well, Tiger Mask, as he was then, much to his chagrin. As the 80s draws to a close, both Misawa and Kawada are getting more and more shine, especially with Tiger Mask teaming with Jumbo Tsuruta and Toshiaki Kawada teaming with Genichiro Tenryu, playing their own part in what was basically the main feud at the time between the company's 2 top aces, and gradually getting more and more significant wins in both tag matches and singles. A part of this did have to do with Giant Bubba, recognising his age and limitations, taking a couple of steps down the card and allowing the youngsters to gradually take his place. Misawa and Kawada were the main beneficiaries of this, and they would later be joined by other hot prospects like Kenta Kobashi and Akira Taue close to the end of the decade, as they come from the dojo and start getting reputations of their own. There's a definite slow build to Misawa and Kawada becoming superstars as we head into the 90s, but particularly in the case of Mitsuharu Misawa, circumstances are going to push him up the card a hell of a lot sooner than most people thought he was going to get there. We've talked a little about Misawa getting more and more shine as Tiger Mask in singles matches, but Kawada was gradually getting more of his own, albeit mostly in tag matches with Genichiro Tenryu. What you would often see a lot of the time is a match where Kawada and Tenryu team against the likes of, say, Hansen and Gordy or Tsuruta and Yoshiaki Yatsu. Tenryu gets taken out for a fair bit, and Kawada ends up having to hold the fort on his own. And often he's more than capable of doing so, while also taking an absolute hell of a beating and selling like no tomorrow. Kawada's team with Tenryu is his own big breakthrough into the heavyweight world, and it comes from finally seizing an opportunity. 1988's year-ending real-world tag league tournament would have initially seen Tenryu team with established heavyweight Asura Hara, but he was fired just before the tournament due to running up gambling debts, and Kawada would be more than capable of taking his place. In fact, the team of Kawada and Tenryu go all the way to the final, eventually losing in an exceptional match against Stan Hansen and Terry Gordy, one of the best matches that the company had ever put on at that time. Kawada was heavily showcased for much of the bout. It pretty much seems like he's been set up as a tag specialist, which is not a surprise in retrospect considering that Kawada eventually goes on to become the most successful tag wrestler in All Japan's history, and he is undoubtedly one of the greatest ever tag team wrestlers in the entirety of wrestling. Already he's had 3 excellent teams by this point. He's had Footloose with Fuyuki, the Revolution team with Tenryu, and he's now also started teaming with Tiger Mask as well. Kawada and Misawa had already teamed before, as early as 1984 when Tiger Mask debuted, and Kawada was still largely losing most of his matches. But at the start of 1990 they really began to team in earnest, bringing the two school friends closer together. As juniors, the team were as high-flying as they came. Kawada was just as capable, if not even more so, of flying and flipping around as a junior than Misawa was, but now as heavyweights things were a little different for them. The start of the 90s gradually sees Kawada adopt the style he's more famous for, the hefty strikes and so forth, while Misawa was already starting to dial down the acrobatics due to the damage it was doing to his body, which was just one of the many reasons why he really wanted to drop the damn Tiger Mask gimmick already. Misawa's frustration behind the mask was hardly something that he kept secret. It was pretty bloody clear backstage, and he'd frequently ask Bubba when he would be able to get rid of the blasted fin, only for Bubba to always tell him that it would come eventually, and to be patient. Misawa's irritants bled through in other areas, taking any little chance he had to subtly mock the gimmick. It's not like people knew that it was Misawa behind the mask after all, that wasn't advertised. He's Tiger Mask, and Tiger Mask is supposed to be this ultra-clean superhero for the children. Mitsuharu Misawa, on the other hand, is a man who was always known for joking around backstage and having a rather dirty sense of humour. And so you would get the odd thing like Misawa being interviewed by Japanese magazines as Tiger Mask while he was injured, and saying that he'd spent a lot of time during his recovery reading pornography. Partly Misawa typically goofing out, partly in order to get himself the damned hell out of this bloody gimmick that he hates. And finally his time will come, and it will come with All Japan having taken a massive hit. The big rivalry in All Japan at the start of 1990 has been going for a good few years. Jumbo Tsuruta against Genichiro Tenryu. They are the two undisputed aces and biggest draws, and every time they clash they absolutely bring the house down. Not only are these matches very popular, but they are also by far the best match the company can put on. In particular, their match on June the 5th, 1989 is possibly the greatest bout the company had in its history up to that point, and is considered by a lot of people to be a forerunner bout to the Kins Road style that defined the company in the 1990s. We'll get to that soon enough. On April the 19th, 1990, they face off in another classic war. It is not presented in any way as being the end of the feud between these two incredible wrestlers, but it would be the last time that Tsuruta and Tenryu were ever in a ring together. Out of the blue, All Japan is going to face a great exodus. Now, if you want plenty of details about what happened, then I suggest you check out the video I did about the SWS, or Super World Sports. But to briefly summarise, Tenryu struck a deal in April 1990 with McGann Super, a glasses company who were looking to launch their own wrestling promotion. Tenryu immediately leaves All Japan and takes a whole bunch of the mid-card with him, eventually. The likes of Asahara Hara, Yoshiaki Yatsu, Shunji Takano, the Great Kabuki, Hiromichi Fuyuki, and more all leave with Tenryu, seriously gutting the All Japan roster. It's a terrible turn of events for the company, and it's not something that Giant Baba's going to forget about. He flat out says that neither Tenryu nor any of the wrestlers who left with him are ever going to work for All Japan Pro Wrestling again, which is something that will indeed hold true while Giant Baba is alive anyway. It seems plausible that Toshiaki Kawada could have left with Tenryu as well, seeing as Tenryu was, after all, his mentor, but according to him anyway, he never knew about Tenryu's plans. But whether he did or not, he did decide to stay on at All Japan, a decision that will prove to be very much the right one, beyond the simple fact of SWS turning out to be an utter disaster for everyone involved. Anyway, desperate times call for desperate measures. Under a different set of circumstances, Baba may have decided to look to the outside. It's not like he's never brought wrestlers in from other promotions, after all. Another promoter come legendary wrestler may have chosen to bring themselves back up the card, especially if they were on Baba's level of fame. However, he makes the decision to take a different approach. Instead, he looks towards the younger generation, the guys who decided to stay loyal, who certainly have a hell of a lot of potential. Of course, this means Misawa. His days as Tiger Mask are now most certainly numbered. This is also going to mean Kawada, the guy who's largely been in tags but has been climbing higher and higher. It also means other youngsters, most notably Kenta Kobashi and Akira Taue. This duo were similar in many ways to Misawa and Kawada when it came to their backgrounds. Both Kobashi and Taue came from poor childhoods and would have undoubtedly been blue-collar workers if not for a path to pro wrestling that appeared through judo and sumo respectively. Taue in particular was considered a decent prospect in the sumo world, but he chose to reject the brutal and bullying regime of dojo training that was in sumo. In any case, both would do their time in the dojo, having their own initial struggles when it came to truly getting noticed, and they debuted in early 1988, a good few years after Misawa and Kawada. Also, they stayed entirely in All Japan. Neither Kobashi nor Taue ever went on a foreign excursion, largely because the end of the 1980s would mark the closure of All Japan's long-standing relationship with the National Wrestling Alliance, as All Japan decided to become more insular. Giant Baba decides that the answer to this crisis lies inside the company, and he's going to take steps to make sure this doesn't happen again. All Japan, following the first exodus, is often compared to being a walled garden where no one is allowed to leave. You work with All Japan exclusively, or you don't work with them at all. This used to be the way most Puro companies worked, in fact, but in a time where companies like New Japan were starting to work more and more with other Japanese promotions, All Japan decided to shut the door. And as it happens, this strategy is going to pay dividends. The first order of business is the creation of a new star to replace Genichiro Tenryu, something that's got to happen now. And it all starts in earnest on May 14th, 1990. On that date, the team of Tiger Mask and Toshiaki Kawada face off against Samson Fuyuki and Yoshiaki Yatsu, both of whom would soon leave to join Tenryu in SWS. The match goes through a fairly even middle and start, both teams giving each other their best, until the big moment happens. Tiger Mask bursts in a flourish, clears the ring in typical style, and then suddenly commands his tag partner to remove his mask. He does so, revealing Mitsuharu Misawa for the first time in about 7 years or so. The crowd goes absolutely wild. With this new burst of energy, the Misawa Kawada team utterly rout their opposition. Just a few minutes after the unmasking, the match is over, Misawa pinning Fuyuki with a German suplex. Immediately after the match, Misawa gets on the mic and challenges Jumbo Tsuruta to a bout at the Nippon Budokan 3 weeks from now, on June the 8th. This of course is part of the lead up to the classic match that we already talked about in detail at the start of the video, where Misawa cements his status as a new ace by getting the pin over the almighty Tsuruta. Also in the build up, on May 26th in a 6-man bout, right in the middle of the tour, Misawa also gets over his brand new deadly weapon, that being his elbows. Jumbo is not exactly in a giving mood. He's been knocking Kobashi and Taue off the apron all bloomin' night. He tries to do the same to Misawa, who goes absolutely apeshit and beats the utter snot out of Tsuruta with elbows. And that was how the elbow came to be regarded as Misawa's signature strike, as opposed to the kicks of Tiger Mask. The June the 8th Tsuruta match, and indeed this whole tour, will also be the beginning of a feud between the younger and older generations that will see the company produce fantastic work over the next couple of years. But the thing about Misawa's victory on that night was that it wasn't necessarily planned out that way. According to a lot of people, it was a decision that Bubba made on the very night of the show, seeing the energy that the crowd had for Mitsuharu Misawa and how much merchandise sales he was generating. He thought that now was the time to strike, and relayed the message to Jumbo in his locker room. Jumbo was quite taken aback, and actually urged Bubba to reconsider, thinking it was way too soon. But his mind was made up and, well, obviously it was the entirely correct decision. History bears that one out. But it's just the beginning for Jumbo and Misawa. There are many great matches to come, and these matches are going to involve the likes of Kawada, Kobashi and Taue in a big way. The next couple of years of All Japan will be dominated by a war between two factions, the Super Generation Army against Tsuruta-gun. The Super Generation Army is the youngsters, led by Mitsuharu Misawa and consisting of Toshiaki Kawada, Kenta Kobashi, Akira Taue, and also Tsuyoshi Kikuchi, Kobashi's tag team partner and also a 1988 debutant. Tsuruta-gun is of course led by Jumbo Tsuruta, with his second in command being the surly junior veteran Masanobu Fuchi. Fuchi had been with All Japan since 1974, and there is perhaps no other wrestler more loyal to the company than he. While early on Yoshiaki Yatsu, like Jumbo Tsuruta, an Olympian level amateur wrestler and frequent tag partner of Jumbo's, is also part of the group. However, when Yatsu decides to join Tenryu in SWS, he is replaced by youngsters who've decided to follow Tsuruta's path, specifically Akira Taue, who early on makes the jump from the Super Generation Army to Tsuruta-kun and eventually basically becomes Tsuruta's second in command in the group. While a lot of the major singles matches between the Super Generation Army and Tsuruta-gun members are especially worth highlighting, oftentimes the best way to really experience this titanic feud is by watching the many absolutely awesome six-man matches these stables would put on. Any combination of Misawa, Kawada, Kobashi and Kikuchi against Tsuruta, Fuchi, Taue and company is just about always guaranteed to utterly tear the house down. These are the sort of matches that you show to someone to disprove the often received and frankly rubbish wisdom of Japanese crowds being respectful or quiet. The matches between the old and new generations here are largely absolute cauldrons of heat, with roaring crowds, cacophonous stomping of feet at every near fall, and shaking hard cams all over the shop. Much like the singles matches, the six-man bouts would be long, dramatic, and would often have a clean finish. It'd be rare for them to end in a cluster schmutz or a disqualification. That was no longer the All Japan style. There are truly so many examples of brilliant six-man or more tag bouts between the Super Generation and Tsuruta-gun, but if you had to pick just one of these bouts as an absolute must-see, it has to be the April 20th 1991 bout, the main event of All Japan's Fan Appreciation Day at the ever white-hot Korakuen Hall, with Misawa, Kawada and Kobashi taking on Tsuruta, Taue and Fuchi. This one goes beyond even the usual high standards these teams already had. What we have here is a near 50-minute colossus of a bout where six guys at the very top of their game play their roles to perfection and construct an in-ring epic, the sort that grabs you immediately and makes you forget that time is even a thing. A beautiful mix of technical superiority combined with utterly believable hatred. It's one of the greatest matches in All Japan history, and while there are certainly other six-man tags between these two groups that reach the same dizzy heights, this is undoubtedly the multi-man match where everyone should start at. It's here, both in the multi-man matches and of course in the singles matches, where All Japan and Giant Bubba are starting to build the style that will define them for the whole decade, the Royal Road or King's Road. King's Road differs immediately from the norm in that it's not solely a Giant Bubba creation. All of the style's major proponents would have had a huge impact on it, but initially a lot of the decisions that led to All Japan's change of style were done in conference with editors and journalists from Weekly Pro Wrestling, one of Japan's most popular Puro mags, and one that would get very close to All Japan by the end of the 80s, having a heavy influence on booking decisions and, indeed, being one of the driving forces behind the ascension of the young Misawa. In fact, the genesis of Kins Road really started a couple of years before the events that seriously exacerbated it. A change in style was necessary due to the white-hot popularity of Akira Maeda's UWF in 1988. Even if this incarnation of the UWF didn't last long, its promotion of clean and decisive finishes and a more real form of pro wrestling was completely different to the established norms, and it changed what the audiences wanted to see. In the 1980s, just as in New Japan, it was fairly common for All Japan's main events to end in draws, countouts or disqualifications. This was something of a cornerstone of what would nowadays be called Showa Pro-Res, after the corresponding Japanese era. UWF essentially tore that book apart, and the two big companies needed to change accordingly. The December 1987 New Japan riot in Sumo Hall was symbolic of that need to change, although the discontent and anger among grapple fans at the repetitive nature of the big pro wrestling wasn't isolated to such extreme incidents, and this necessitated the birth not just of Kins Road, but of New Japan's Strong style. What's also important to note is that this is a time of change in general. The Emperor Hirohito dies at the beginning of 1989, ending the Showa era and beginning the Heisei era of Akihito. A new era, in the eyes of both Baba and indeed Inoki, necessitates the promotion of a new style of professional wrestling. So Kins Road is a philosophy on how a match should be laid out and what should happen in order to make it the best match possible. Now, as I just alluded to, an important part of Kins Road is that usually there should be a clean finish. 9 times out of 10, the victory will be by pinfall. Giant Baba was not particularly a fan of submissions, and when Kins Road was implemented, submission victories in All Japan became incredibly rare, to the point where on the highly infrequent occasions in All Japan where a match was won by submission, fans would be confused as to whether the match had actually ended or not. As far as the layout of a match went, Baba had a simple guideline, that it was foolish to repeat a move over and over again and expect different results. A guiding principle of Kins Road is that a match should build up and up, with the moves getting bigger and bigger over time, right up to the finish. As we'll most certainly see in the course of Misawa and Kawada's matches, a philosophy like this is what leads to incredible importance being put upon moves, especially when it comes to new moves that quite often are introduced specifically for big matches. It's in this environment where the super moves thrived, where we see the likes of the Tiger Driver 91, Burning Hammer, Dangerous DDT and so on come into play over time. Beyond the big finishers, almost everyone has a strike they specialise in to bridge the gaps between moves, something which often can finish a match in its own right. To take a few examples, Misawa has elbows, Kawada has kicks, Jumbo Tsuruta has lariats and knees, Kobashi has chops and lariats, Taue has chops and, although it's not really a strike, he has a hell of a lot of choke slams. Of course, what we are seeing here is the establishment of the young quartet that represent All Japan's immediate future, the 4 Pillars of Heaven, or 4 Corners of Heaven, or simply the 4 Kins. While 4 Pillars wasn't explicitly used to describe these 4 wrestlers until 1993, it is in this period where they come together. As it happens, this quartet are not the original 4 Pillars. The original moniker was given out in the 1960s, all the way back in the JWA days, to Rikidozan's 4 great trainees, that being Giant Baba, Antonio Inoki, the legendary Korean wrestler Kintaro Oki, and the Fireball Kid Michaki Yoshimura. In many ways, the creation of this new set of 4 pillars was a response to a similar group of young wrestlers in New Japan, the 3 Musketeers of Shinya Hashimoto, Masahiro Chono, and Keiji Muto. And clearly, the success of these 7 wrestlers can hardly be overstated. They certainly all fit the billing. This moniker isn't the only callback to the past. There's a fair bit to say about the colours the wrestlers choose to wear. Misawa's choice of emerald green is actually in tribute to an All Japan wrestler who he cited as one of his influences and first favourites when watching the shows as a child. the heel Horst Hoffman. Taue's choice of red is a clear Bubba reference, as is a great deal of his moveset. And after several rather questionable stylistic choices, Kawada settles on black and yellow, which is in direct reference to his mentor, the recently departed Genichiro Tenryu. These are the sort of little details that will become commonplace in the long and epic rivalries that define All Japan in the 1990s, and they're certainly worth poring over. Although of course the matches themselves are where it's at. There's so many great ones. On August 31st, Kenta Kobashi puts on a spirited performance against Jumbo Tsuruta despite being so clearly outmatched, showing off his own credentials. He'd do even better in a match they had in 1991, although he would come up short both times. The very next night, Jumbo looks for revenge against Misawa, and the result is perhaps even better than the first match. Things are different this time. This is no longer a friendly rivalry between a master and his pupil like it was in the Tiger Mask days. This is deeply personal, and Jumbo wants to put this young pup back in his place. The heat in the Nippon Budokan is unreal even before the bell, the chants at the very top of the lungs, and even the deep-voiced Bubba on commentary might get a little carried away. The entirely different feel this match has to the first one is just filled with layers. The bitter enmity and storyline between the two, the desperation for Jumbo, a man who had basically been peerless in All Japan for more than a decade, to try and hold on to his spot, the callbacks to that first bout, and Misawa's desire to get the better of Jumbo once more. There's more than just moments of technical brilliance. There's also times when the whole thing just threatens to get out of control, where it almost becomes a fight and Jumbo becomes so savage that the crowd even boo him, something that previously would have been unthinkable. It just makes Misawa's comebacks all the hotter as he flies through the air at Jumbo, peppers him with elbows, gets near falls from roll-ups and suplexes. On this night at least, Jumbo will get a measure of revenge. After an epic 25 minutes, a superplex, followed by his signature backdrop, will get him a free count. But needless to say, this isn't over in the slightest. I mean, I could highlight every match this pair had, singles, tags, six-man, anything. But if you have to see just two, you gotta see the June 8th and September 1st matches, because they are two of the very greatest ever. Of course, Toshiaki Kawada will also have great matches against Jumbo Tsuruta, particularly in 1991. Unlike Misawa, Kawada never quite manages to get the better of Jumbo, and perhaps the matches he has aren't quite on the same level of heat as far as the crowd goes, but they're still damn good, and feature Dangerous K really starting to come into his own. Like Misawa, he's fully found the style that works for him, the brutal kicks, that little touch of arrogance, the stiff intenseness when required. The second half of 1991 in particular sees Kawada really shine. With Misawa taking a little bit of time off to nurse some injuries, Kawada gets some big spots and incredible matches of his own. His match against Jumbo Tsuruta on October 24th is magnificent. The pair take some absolute lumps out of each other, and the crowd sure do love it. I mean, I don't know if it's the black and yellow that Kawada wears reminding Tsuruta so much of Tenryu, but geez, there's almost as much, if not more, hatred in these matches than there is in the Misawa vs Tsuruta matches. It's incredible. Outside of the whole Super Generation vs Revolution feud, however, the definitive Kawada singles matches before Misawa Kawada really kicks off come against Stan Hansen in 1992. This pair were just made for each other, and the raging, utterly violent pair of matches they have for Hansen's Triple Crown are highly recommended, almost as much as I would recommend the Misawa Tsuruta matches. From a business perspective, this elevation of a new generation, not just Misawa but Kawada, Kobashi and company, going against the older guard, was excellent, and it would continuously sell out the Nippon Budokan and most any other venue that the promotion ran in. This brand new style for All Japan, this Royal Road, it seriously bloody worked. That said, Misawa and Tsuruta was the main story, and indeed the main draw. The general crux of the story, especially after June 8th, 1990, was that the crowd were desperate to see Misawa pin Tsuruta again to get that full-on decisive victory. But in true All Japan style, Bubba, as Booker, had a lengthy story to tell, and would stretch it out as long as possible, with the ultimate ending presumably being Misawa defeating Tsuruta for the Triple Crown titles. He'd have a chance to do just that on April the 18th, 1991 in what is, needless to say, another classic of a match, but again he would come up short. Misawa, however, would get some revenge on Tsuruta on the 4th of September when his Super Generation Army team, with Kawada, defended the tag titles against Tsuruta and Taue, and Misawa scores a rare submission victory against Jumbo using his face lock. In All Japan booking logic, as in most other places, a pin or submission in this case in a tag bout is most certainly a big step towards a pin in a singles match. Only the great length of All Japan Kings Road era stories highlights such moments even more, as we'll see when we get to Misawa Kawada. The crowd always wants it so desperately, the story stringing it all along until we reach that breaking point. And unfortunately the Misawa and Tsuruta feud just didn't quite make it there. Tsuruta and Misawa was a feud that, through outside circumstances, didn't come to that decisive end. The pair continued at a blistering pace until 1992, when Jumbo was diagnosed with hepatitis B. He tried to continue a full schedule, but eventually he just found it too much. He took a whole year off after the October Giant Series tour. And so the last singles bout between Misawa and Tsuruta was on April 8th, 1992 during the Champions Carnival, and they went to a 30-minute time limit draw. While presumably this wasn't supposed to be their last singles match, it is something of a decent ending for it to finish in this way. Misawa and Tsuruta as absolute equals at the very top, unable to get any kind of advantage over each other, let alone a clear and decisive one. In the end, it's honours even. Jumbo Tsuruta was never the same after his return from treatment, but he would continue for a few years in the mid-card, much like Giant Bubba, until officially retiring in February 1999. Before his retirement, he flat out told Motoko Baba to step aside and let Misawa take his rightful position at the head of the company, words that unfortunately fell on deaf ears and led to Jumbo leaving the company altogether. Sadly, Jumbo Tsuruta wouldn't have long after this. He and his family moved to the USA to work part-time at the University of Oregon, but was diagnosed with liver cancer caused by his hepatitis. Jumbo Tsuruta passed away in Manila on May 13, 2000 from complications during a liver transplant operation. For all he had achieved in his career and in his life, Jumbo was only 49 years old when he passed away, but he left a damn near unmatchable legacy as basically one of the greatest to ever do it in professional wrestling history. And so with that, this first part will end. Amusingly, we haven't even got to the first Misawa vs Kawada match yet. However, with all the storylines and the details that run through this feud, it is important to look at what came beforehand, not just their upbringing and this coming of age, but the shared rivalries. There's a very clear line from Tsuruta against Tenryu to Tsuruta against Misawa, and then to Misawa against Kawada. And examining these classic feuds just makes watching Misawa vs Kawada all the better, really. When we return, we will be in 1992, and Misawa will finally take to the ring against his partner. At first it will be quite friendly, but make no mistake, this will not last. Bye for now.